Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Jonah Davids. Jonah is the communications director at the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. He also has a new Substack called Mental Disorder, which explores the science and politics of mental health from a data-driven perspective. I've known Jonah for a number of years on Twitter and through his work with the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology, but I was glad to see that he's starting to, put some of his thoughts down in this Substack. And so I thought we'd get together and have this conversation about mental health and the ways in which data, integrating insights from data can start to maybe make some improvements on the field. I found that Jonah's always an interesting and provocative person to interact with. So Jonah, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks for coming on. So, like I said, you've got this new Substack. It's focused on basically, how you can assess mental health in a data-driven way. And I just wanted to start by asking you, what was the impetus behind starting this project? What was the sort of the problems you saw with the current state of mental health that you thought would be good to begin addressing through this work?
So a project like this has been a long time coming for me. I'm 24 years old now, and my interest in mental health started when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. I was always kind of a unhappy kid. My sister had all kinds of behavioral issues, so I would read parenting books that my parents left around the house to try and figure out how to sort her out. But I've just always been really interested in why people seem so unhappy, how to feel better, how to have a better life. And as I grew up, that seemed to be a bigger and bigger fixation of the culture more broadly. And in some sense, it took on a bit of a political element to it with, increased calls for mental health acceptance. Mental health in some ways became an identity like any other, that people could sort of participate in and that you could use to get, in some cases more medical treatment, but in other cases, certain kinds of maybe epistemic power in social situations, telling people, you don't really understand what this is like because you're not depressed or something like that. So growing up in that kind of environment, I wanted to become a psychiatrist, and I figured, what better way to learn more about mental health and help people than to do that. So I went to school for psychology, and within about the first year, I sort of noticed that reading all these psychological texts, reading the actual studies, that the picture of mental health that had been painted by popular culture, and in some cases, mental health professionals themselves, was just totally off, So the big thing that really stuck out at me, for example, was there's no evidence that the more credentialed you are, so being a psychiatrist versus being a normal therapist versus being a nobody, makes you better at giving talk therapy, right? So one famous study I remember was they had English professors give talk therapy and psychologists give talk therapy. Presumably if being a psychologist made you a better therapist, you would see a big difference there, but you don't see anything, right? So basically, the more I actually studied psychology and the more I learned about it, the more I was like, okay, this is really, really different than what I thought. And many of the kinds of claims that the mental health professionals and maybe popular culture, mental health culture, are making are just really not backed up by much evidence. So over time, I became less interested in the actual, hands-on improving somebody's mental health and more in the how did it get to be this way? And, what could we actually do to harness these kind of data-driven insights to make the mental health system better.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up sort of that track that you were on, because I remember reading one of your pieces a while ago about your sort of decision to leave grad school and kind of the problems that you saw inherent in the kind of the incentives that were there, and also just the value of the stuff that you were learning, things like the replication crisis that were continuing to be taught in classes, and kind of this double speak that professors would do where they tell you one thing in private and then they are doing another thing in public. And it seems to me like part of this was that you just became very disillusioned with the current state of the field. Would that be a way to describe it?
Yeah, disillusioned for sure. And I think it's fair to say that some amounts of disillusionment are warranted. Sometimes it's easy to go overboard. Um, but I just in general don't like pretending that okay, what I'm doing or what I'm learning is really important or really true when it's not, and we all kind of secretly know it's not. And so yeah, the same issues, of the replication crisis in psychology and other social sciences sort of dovetailed nicely with my sort of noticing this really big gap between what medical or mental health professionals were saying, and what sort of licensing and occupational standards were, and what the data actually suggested. So yeah, the lesson of the replication crisis is not to totally ignore all the data or all the professionals, but to just look carefully look critically and see, okay, like the stuff that holds up, what is it saying? Is it saying these things are really important, make really big impacts, or is it sort of saying the opposite?
Right. And so I guess we can start to dig into a few of the topics that you've written on, and kind of drill down on some of the details when we talk about the, fitting the data to the, reputation or the narratives within the field. That seems to be a lot of what your work is really about, is digging into kind of the empirical side of things and seeing if that actually matches a lot of the narratives that are commonly held or even espoused by the fields themselves. So, for example, one of the pieces that you did was on CBT, that is clinical behavioral therapy, and whether it's
Cognitive behavioral therapy.
oh, sorry, cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Um, and the degree to which it's as effective or more effective than other talk therapies. Um, so you wrote that essentially the from what you can tell of various, you did some summaries of some various studies and meta-analyses on this, is that cognitive behavioral therapy basically uh, established itself as the kind of gold standard because it showed some efficaciousness in a very rigorous way, um, perhaps earlier than other forms of talk therapy, but that overall, even though it is effective at treating, for example, depression, it doesn't appear to be more effective than other kinds of talk therapy, right? Um, so talk to me a little bit about what was sort of the way you were sort of thinking about that when you started to dig into the assessment of CBT, and what you're sort of drawing in terms of conclusions from making that analysis.
So in psychology, for quite a long time, there's been sort of this idea of like the dodo bird verdict, which is
Mm,
I think was created by Hans Eysenck or something like that. And it's basically this idea that all the therapies don't really do anything, and even if they do something, it's all kind of the same. Um, and that's kind of been a question for a long time because in the history of psychology, right, you have Freud coming out with the talking cure, and that takes on a lot of prominence, and people start copying that, and sort of then you got different approaches branching off from that. But as you said, with CBT, they started to really take it very seriously, as a sort of scientific uh, idea, and we're testing it pretty rigorously. Um, and so that takes off. People then say, okay, it's the gold standard. It's better than these other therapies, which then sort of come to be seen as less scientific or pseudoscientific. But then there's people sort of always sort of hovering around that, being like, well, is it really true? Is CBT really that much better? Is there something about CBT which involves CBT is like the idea that your beliefs, your thoughts, your behaviors are all sort of related. So if you change one, change the other. Is there something about that framework and the sort of way that it's done? They have books like Mind Over Mood that you can buy and do it yourself. What about that in particular makes it so much better? And people spent a lot of time like really digging into it and coming up with these elaborate arguments for why that's so much better than psychodynamic therapy or Freudian therapy, or um,
mhm.
all this stuff. And uh, at the end of the day, when you look at all the evidence and you have all the studies sort of side by side, especially studies where you compare CBT to these other therapies directly. So it's the same study. Some people got CBT, some people got this other kind of therapy. You can really see that, it doesn't make a big difference, if there's a difference at all. Definitely not a statistically significant difference. Now, what does that mean? Well, you could sort of interpret it a couple different ways. So one way would be that, well, all therapy is just good. Therapy is good in and of itself. It doesn't really matter what the method is. It's just so good that no matter what we do, no matter whether we frame it as being about your thoughts and feelings, or it's about your, id, ego, superego, however you frame it, it's just so good to talk to people that it's going to deliver, positive results. And then the other way of framing it is, well, it's all a placebo effect. We've convinced millions of people that this has some kind of mental health improving, property to it, and so by doing it, no matter sort of how we frame it, people just think they're going to get better, and they do.
So, okay, all right. So that's sort of the framing that you are setting up for us, and one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was that maybe there's room for a third other thing, okay? So to speak, which is like, could it be perhaps that so like one takeaway is like, maybe, yes, you're right, maybe all the talk therapies are just like somewhat effective, right? And decently effective, and it doesn't matter which one you choose. I think that's sort of how you ended the article, was sort of like, patients should be less picky or something like that. And that's like one takeaway. And I guess even if it is just a placebo, you could say the same thing, right? Like, now maybe that means like you could do some other activity. Like I could tell you, oh, you need to just like go for a walk in the park or something like that. And if you believe that, then maybe it would have the same effectiveness as something like talk therapy. Let's say you go for a 1 hour walk once a week or something like that. But I guess I was talking to a friend of mine about this piece after reading it, and he had a different take, which I'm going to present to you now, which was that perhaps the issue is that these the effectiveness of these therapies in particular cases is just not very amenable to the methods of like a standardized clinical trial. And that really the issue is that you need to get much more particular or much more fine-grained about certain aspects of the therapy, like, for example, the fit of a particular method to an individual patient. Or he suggested that actually what you really would want to be paying attention to is the quality of the relationship of the patient to the therapist, and that it's actually this joining that between two individuals that is actually more important than necessarily the method itself. So what do you think about those sort of objections?
So there's the sort of objection that, okay, it's not fine-grained enough, right? So maybe this is just we're painting with too broad a brush. There's the objection that the things that actually matter are going to be more like your relationship with the therapist, or sort of other variables that happen within the therapy. And the third one that I'll add, that I hear a lot of psychotherapists talk about when they criticize these kinds of studies, is they say all these studies are, looking at like 8-10 weeks of therapy, often less. A real therapeutic breakthrough doesn't happen until maybe 6 months to a year. So I think those are all interesting. The second one about, well, maybe it's about the relationship to the person or to the therapist. I do think there are studies where they look at like how much does relationship fit, increase your chance of having a positive outcome. And it does increase your chance of having a positive outcome, but I think it's not by as much as, people might think. Maybe it's, I should really write an article on it, but I think it's around, maybe 20-30% of the variance in outcomes could be explained by that. So that's not nothing, but that's, it's not like a huge difference. Of course, that's on average. In terms of, some people have maybe fit better with other therapies, I would say, yeah, probably. And I think that's actually a good reason to treat each therapy with less reverence and not get so hung up on like, oh, this therapy is evidence-based and this one is not.
Mm,
Because maybe really rational people do well with cognitive behavioral therapy. Maybe those kinds of people really like to see themselves as sort of, as having widgets inside they can turn and like make their anxiety less or something. And maybe there's other people who are more holistic, who want some kind of more feeling, touchy-feely thing, or people who want something more spiritual or religious. So I would say 100%. I think, we should have less reverence for each therapy so that people feel more comfortable choosing among them. But I would say that all these criticisms, I don't think get at the problem, which is that for so many people who want to get therapy, or it might be insurance providers, it might be programs, they're only going to fund evidence-based like CBT or these like evidence-based therapies based on
mm,
clinical trials data, whatever. And I just think that if the goal is to actually get more people to do therapy and to have a positive experience, whatever the therapy, then we should try and get past that kind of thinking and say, okay, maybe they all kind of work in different ways for different people.
mm. Right. So, I mean, that's sort of a positive spin on it. But there's a lot of talk also, especially in like variations of like the Twitter sphere right now, that all therapy is basically useless and it's a waste of your time, it's a waste of your money. I saw a tweet like the other day that was like, don't go to therapy, just like get a gym membership or something like that. And it's like,
Right.
well, I already have a gym membership, thank you, but I go pretty regularly, but like it's that's sort of like the other attitude. There's sort of a swinging in the opposite direction. So I sort of see, in some ways, there's kind of two cultural currents right now. There's a sort of like when you spoke in the beginning about sort of the ascent of a kind of therapeutic culture, right? This idea that everybody needs to go to therapy and everybody has trauma that they need to work through, and we should all just be like introspecting all the time. That's sort of like one cultural current. And I think, unfortunately, these currents they tend to be, I mean, it seems as if they're politically self-sorted. I don't know if that's actually true. That would be an interesting thing to find out, if like liberals or conservatives are more or less likely to go to therapy. I would guess that it is politically biased. That being said, the other current is sort of this more dismissive approach, which just says, you know what, therapy is just a waste of time. Don't even do it. Just focus on like improving your life, improving your conditions and other like more material ways. And forget about all this talking nonsense. You're just sort of doing a bunch of like rumination and paying someone a lot of money for it. What do you think about that sort of framing of the debate? It seems to me like it's sort of polarizing in those two directions.
Yeah, I do agree with you, and it's to me it seems to be polarized around. There's a left versus right thing. There's also, I think, a masculine feminine thing there too, right? I mean, maybe those are
Mhm.
correlated, but yeah, you do have the people who have sort of gone overboard on therapy and mental health culture and turned everything into kind of a mental health issue, to which you know the way to deal with it is to talk about it sort of endlessly. And then on the other side, you've got the people who are like, okay, no talking, let's just make money and work out and stuff. Um, I think like if making money and working out it makes you feel better, I think that's great. And actually, one of the things that therapists or the sort of mental health community, I think, has done a terrible job of is dealing with men. Because a lot of the time, the
Mhm.
reason men feel bad is because they're like low on the status pole,
Right.
and
Right.
it's like
Maybe your
they would
life is
actually,
actually just kind of crappy right now, and that's why you feel bad.
yeah, I really think that if most, maybe not most, but if a lot of men who are just depressed, if you took them out of their lives and you suddenly made them like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or some billionaire or something like that, they would just be like, oh, this is great, I don't feel bad anymore, you know
Mhm.
so there is that aspect to it, which is like, if you feel bad and you feel unhappy with your life, then figuring out how to actually improve it can be great. Now, the only problem with that, I think, is sometimes the reason that you're not improving your life is because there are things about yourself that you don't realize that are standing in your way of just having a good life. So, one really good example is a friend of mine who has sort of everything going for him in terms of he's got money, he's got some influence, he's handsome, people like him, but he just thinks everybody hates him, and there's no objective reason for it. It's just in his mind he's like, oh, everybody hates me. Don't know why, he's just always been like that. And he actually went to therapy, and the therapist just helped him understand, no, not everybody hates you, it's in your head. And nobody else could convince him of this. But talking to a therapist, talking to someone who was sort of, an impartial, neutral observer, just made him realize, okay, it's actually, not a real problem, except for in my head. And that helped him then make friends and go and live the good life he wanted to live. So there are definitely people, I think, who have real mental blocks and who a sort of objective third party can help them deal with. Does that person, though, need to be trained in psychology? Do they have to have read Freud or gotten, an advanced degree? I don't think so. But I just do think there are people that can give you some perspective. And I think that is the real value in therapy for sort of, most people. That's sort of setting aside people with schizophrenia or something, which is sort of another conversation.
Right. So it may also be that the severity of the symptoms or the level of distress requires a more advanced, training, let's just say. Whereas for most people that are within a moderate range of mental wellness or, just having some mild symptoms, it doesn't seem to matter that much, the education level of the therapist.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not certain of this, but I would also wonder whether for people with more advanced problems, it matters a ton too. Because, I mean, if someone has really bad schizophrenia, I mean, I don't really know if anybody knows what to do to help that person tremendously, other than maybe pharmacological options. But yeah, that to me seems like one of those things where maybe experience, maybe it's just know-how, maybe some people are just better at communicating with other people or helping them to understand their own internal states. But it doesn't seem to me like doing tons and tons of coursework or passing some fancy degree is necessarily going to translate into being better, just helping people with their most basic problems.
Right. So well, one offshoot of that, if I were to take that seriously, and I was in a position to do something with that information, would be that I would perhaps consider lowering the requirements for someone to become a licensed, mental health professional across the board. Maybe to just increase accessibility to therapy, drive the price down, whatever it may be. It seems like you could make a very good case for that if it turns out that, a lot of the stuff is for lack of a better term, just gatekeeping.
Yeah. And it's actually funny. So people have known that this is gatekeeping for years. One of the books I have over actually, I'll show the camera. It's a great book. I recommend anyone who's interested in reading. House of Cards by Robin Dawes. This book came out in, I think, 1990 something. But this book just shows all the gatekeeping. It all it does is summarize clinical evidence and things, and just makes it pretty obvious that these higher levels of expertise or credentials or sometimes even experience don't lead to people being able to deliver better outcomes for their patients. And I do think that the obvious, as you put it, the obvious policy recommendation that follows from that is you should make it way easier for people to become mental health professionals You should lower the certification standards, and even the education standards. Like, it's easier for most people to become a lawyer than it would be to become a clinical psychologist, right?
Yes.
And we've got way too many lawyers and not enough clinical psychologists. To be a clinical psychologist, right, you
Well,
have to do
how do
your.
we know we don't have enough clinical psychologists?
Okay, well, fair enough. The reason I would say we don't have enough, um, let me repeat it. We don't have enough people who are treating people with severe mental health issues.
Okay.
Maybe those should be a clinical psychologist, maybe not, um, but there's massive shortages, right? Not only do people leave these jobs because they say they're burned out, but there's just simply not enough people who are wanting to do what's really grueling work for, pay that's, compared to other advanced professionals, not amazing. And even many people who do become clinical psychologists, there's just such a backlog of patients that they just get, pushed into working overtime,
Mhm.
only seeing their patients for very, very, very short windows because they have to squeeze so many people in. I mean, for those people, if you talk to them, they are really stressed, and they, I think, a lot of the time wish that there were more people coming into that field. So, making it easier for people to do that, I think, would be, at least in terms purely of just filling the backlog of people who need help, a great start.
Yeah, and so I'm glad that we got on the topic of sort of the kinds of people that are going into the field, both the quality and quantity, the level of training needed. Um, because another post that you did was basically about the fact that a lot of psychologists are very sad. And this has been like a trope in popular culture for a long time. You mentioned some of the examples, Good Will Hunting and others in the piece. But it turns out that the stereotype is true. And mental health professionals, by and large, have more um, mental health problems than would be expected from the general population. And um, one of the things that you talk about in this piece is that it appears now you just mentioned that a lot of these workers are stressed by the nature of their work, but it appears that getting a psychology degree or becoming a clinical psychologist, some other mental health professional, doesn't induce any kind of more mental illness than would otherwise be happening to you. Um, it looks, according to you, that the field itself, basically, there's a selection effect in that people who have a history of mental health issues end up becoming psychologists. And I see a little bit of a tension here between what we just stated, which is like maybe the qualifications for becoming a mental health professional should be reduced. And this other odd thing, which is that it turns out a lot of mental health professionals have mental health problems, which isn't necessarily an indictment of their work or whether you should talk to them or anything else, but it does call into question, I guess, a little bit of like the standards, or like whether you actually want to make the field less selective, let's just say. So do you want to talk a little bit about that finding?
For sure. So yeah, I'll just start with the finding, which was, that looking across a bunch of sort of surveys of psychologists, mostly done by psychologists, um, you can see that a lot of them report having, bad mental health, being depressed, being anxious, and they report that at hires, much higher, or levels, excuse me, much higher than the general population. You can also sort of see that over time it seems to get worse, which is not
Oh
good,
boy.
right? You would hope it's heading in the other direction. Some of that may have to do with the field is becoming more and more female, and women on average, have higher rates of mental health issues. So that might explain some of it. But yeah, in any case, I mean, it's not inspiring because, like, if you uh, learn that doctors were like sicker than the average person in the population, you might be more skeptical of doctors, right? Especially if you take a specialty. Like, if you learn that most oncologists had cancer at higher rates than other people in the population, you would sort of think, okay, well, there's something wrong there, right? The people who are treating this problem shouldn't be having it disproportionately. But with mental health professionals, that's what you see. So, and then, as you said, well, you might think, okay, it's due to stress, which I'm sure some of it is. And, I'm sure being around other mentally ill people makes you more mentally ill. But a lot of it seems to be coming from self-selection. So people who are choosing to major in psychology or treat people with mental illness, a lot of the time they themselves have had mental illness and they're now curious about why. Maybe they have family members with mental illness, which, spoiler alert, genetically also means they're more likely to have mental illness because it's pretty heritable and all these things. So, and, I definitely agree that if you take people who are mentally ill and you put them around other more mentally ill people, I mean, they're not gonna feel better, right? They're probably gonna feel worse. So there is that sort of structural factor to start with, which to your point, may be a reason to increase the sort of scrutiny around who ends up doing this. I guess I would say two things about that. So the first thing is, it's not obvious to me that having a mental health problem that makes you like worse at being a therapist or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
or worse at treating other people with the issue. In terms of people, in those surveys reporting it themselves, very few of them said it impacted their work. Although, I mean, I don't know if you should believe them or not. But then the other thing is, I mean, if you screen out those people, who is going to want to do it? Like, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's the kind of job where if you don't have people who are doing it because they really feel in their hearts this is a good thing to do, and I have sort of a desire to heal other people's psyches or something like that, maybe it'll just be really hard to fill those positions as it is. So in a perfect world, I could kind of see an argument like, okay, you have to pass a certain level of mental fitness to be in this role. And perhaps that would actually be the ideal situation. But maybe as things are, that's too much to ask, given there's already not enough people going in.
Right. So, yeah, that's interesting. I think there is definitely a case to be made that, I mean, certainly having a history of mental health issues, um, depending on their severity, depending on their, likelihood of like continuing symptoms, shouldn't be disqualifying, but it may actually, perhaps make someone, besides the fact that it gives them maybe a motivation to, uh, fix others' problems or help other people who are going through similar issues, it may actually be helpful in getting them to empathize, I think. I mean, I don't know. But I think there's there's another sort of contrarian take, which is that like you sort of like the wounded healer, right, is an archetype. And that's, I think, how a lot of people that go into the profession, at least that I've interacted with, sort of view it, right? And so, I mean, that's interesting. Whether the standards for, what I would say is, in defense of like educational and credential, I'm not a credentialist generally, but in defense of the credentialed approach, at least if you can get through that level of training and education, it shows a certain level of like executive functioning and maybe conscientiousness. And I'm sure there's like some other IQ filter as well. And I mean, I can't imagine that would be worse for the level of care given. But you're saying that it's doesn't appear to actually have a lot of effect if you take, I don't know, a high school counselor or something like that, and you compare them to a clinical psychotherapist. The clinical psychologist has been through a lot more training, and yet you're saying that the data doesn't indicate significant improvement based on this.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I mean, there's a lot in there in what you just said, but to that last point, a lot of mental health problems, like I wouldn't say don't have turnkey solutions. Like it's Good Will Hunting, which we talked about a bit earlier, is like one of my favorite movies, and one of the reasons it's such a great movie, a psychological movie, is that at the end, the Robin Williams character basically just says it's not your fault over and over again, and Matt Damon character starts crying, and then he's like better, and then he goes and lives like a great life, and I just if treating people psychologically were like that, where it's like you find the one thing and then you turn that key and then suddenly they're all better, then maybe there would be an argument for, okay, you need the smartest people to do this. But I'm not totally sure if it's like that. Maybe for some people it is, but in general, a lot of the people who are mentally ill and things like that basically just need to be cared for. And so I almost think somebody maybe who's more of an EMT type person, someone who's comfortable with taking risks, who cares about people, who's willing to act quickly. Perhaps that is a better psychological profile for a mental health worker than somebody who's like a genius. I mean, if the geniuses were really, if being a genius is really doing most of the heavy lifting, then I think you would see it show up, right? So you would really see the smarter people being better therapists, or having better outcomes. But you just don't see that, which makes me think it's just not that kind of problem.
Right. So it could be more about a personality fit, or
I mean,
some other attributes.
you ever meet somebody and you can immediately sort of know what their problem is? Like, you know what I mean? Like sometimes you meet somebody, you interact with somebody, and you just realize, oh, this person's just really shy, or oh, this person's just really angry, or something like that. And it doesn't take a genius to notice those things. What it does take is just someone who has outside perspective to then say, like, okay, you seem angry. How do you deal with that? Or so, yeah, I think it's less genius and just more perspective.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess we've talked a little bit about the efficaciousness of various psycho or talk therapies. We've talked about psychologists themselves. I'm curious, like, what are some of the other kind of main issues that you have bouncing around in your head to sort of take a look at and apply this sort of data-driven approach to the field? What have you been pondering?
I guess a lot of stuff that falls under the sort of, is it true? They say it in popular mental health culture, is it true? And then in some stuff that's sort of about what's coming next. So in the first bucket, like, I'm very interested in questions about like the demographics of therapists and whether that affects people's response. Because like there's lots of people who will say things like, oh, like if you're Black, you need to have a Black therapist, or if you're a woman, you need to have a woman therapist. And it's seen as something you're sort of entitled to, but the entitlement is based on essentially some kind of evidence, right? So I'm really interested in looking more into that and seeing whether that holds up.
Ostensibly some kind of evidence. I mean, it just seems so superficial, right? That some random identity characteristic would need to be the same, especially given that we've talked about all the ways in which individual variation doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right. Like already, how smart they are, how educated they are, this, that, the other thing. I mean, I can't imagine that out of all the variation that would matter, something is so surface level as that would be like the big thing, that's going to get you an improvement.
Yeah,
So,
I mean
I guess I look forward to you maybe debunking some of that.
Well, it was something a lot of my friends used to always say growing up, is like I had a friend who was Korean, and she'd say like, oh, you have to have like a Korean therapist, because how in the world is some Jewish guy going to understand, like everything I go through, or something like that. And it just seems to me like a very pervasive myth. So I mean, well, I don't know it's a myth. I think it's a myth. So I'm going to look into that. I think stuff around like there's all these people who are talking about, chat GPT and artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And I think we actually talked quite a long time ago. I think we talked a bit about this on Twitter, um, about whether that is going to be a successful replacement for therapists, right? And
Mhm.
I think if you buy into sort of my model of therapy, I think it would lead you to think, yeah, this is not a elite skill. This is someone who's talking to somebody, asking questions, giving perspective, showing warmth. But if you take the view that it's more of a uh, comprehensive personal process, then maybe you really do need a person who knows you and your history and cares and things like that. So right, like right now,
Well,
tons.
so I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, no,
I
go ahead.
have one, I have like an interesting point about that, which is that, so yeah, I mean, given it's plausible, right, that I can train, and I know there are companies working on this. I was looking into this, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. Um, you know, AI therapist. But a lot of people have been working on this for a long time, and it's finally getting to the point where it might be uh real or effectively real. And one of the things that I think is like odd is that, like, yes, I could train an algorithm to be able to spit out responses to you. And I guess, now we could even do it. It doesn't even have to be text. It could also be, voice, and video, even that approximate, maybe even to a degree that's like noticeably, reasonably undetectable, um, what kind of responses you would get from being with an actual human therapist. But I would wonder if part of the psychological component is the point about being seen. Like you said earlier, that what a lot of these people need is maybe someone that actually just cares about them. And I'm wondering if maybe it would be ineffective for you to hear the right things from a machine, knowing that it's a machine, instead of knowing that it's another human being.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, there are some people who, like Robin Dawes, who I mentioned earlier, who has that book, who have said things like therapy is just really, it's just sort of friendship, right? When you have a
Mm.
therapeutic experience or having a friendship experience that is sort of structured in such a way that you don't know that that's what's happening, but ultimately it is. And so if therapy really is about a connection, about a friendship, then yeah, maybe you would need to feel there's a person at the other end, you know, who is and that I guess would be the difference between like doing online therapy and a chatbot, right? Online therapy, at least there's some person at the other end sipping his coffee who is
Mm.
reading what you're saying and cares and then writes back. And so maybe if it is that psychological experience that is what people want, then AI therapy wouldn't be enough.
Yeah, or maybe it would be. Maybe people would just convince themselves that this machine actually cares about me. I mean, there's that case of the Google engineer who thought that the AI was like real, like a sentient being, and you know, uh, I'm sure that if people haven't already, like, someone's gonna fall in love with an AI at some point. So it's like,
There's great things about the great videos about like the AI girlfriends that people have,
right.
and
Hmm.
oftentimes it's just like a voice bot, like it's not even like a picture or something.
Yeah.
But these engineers in China or whatever like falling in love with this voice bot, and yeah, maybe for a lot of this stuff, it just will trick us and we'll just be okay with it. And to me, there also do seem to be some advantages of talking to or a bot is not real. So, for example, you might be more honest about how you actually feel with a robot than you would be with a person.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I'd have some serious privacy concerns, but well, I mean, you're trusting the company basically that owns the robot. At
and
least
there've been
in like,
all
well, at least in a therapeutic setting, there's like there are like ethical standards for the field. There's like the therapist client relationship, which is supposed to be, you know, kind of like sacred. The only ways you can really like get information out of it is for like legal reasons, basically. So, you know, a bot, it doesn't feel liable in the same way with your secrets, and it's really just you're trusting that company and whatever their data policy is, that they're going to keep their word and not leak anything or give it to the wrong person, or wantonly hand it over to some authority or whatever, right?
It's a huge problem, actually, because I think there are a few. I'm pretty sure I read about this. There in The Economist. I think there have been a few mental health app companies that were hacked, and their data did get leaked.
Right.
And to the what makes a private AI chatbot good in terms of honesty makes it terrible in terms of a data leak, right? So that is like a
Yeah.
big problem. Although I guess that's also a problem with all sort of online, software. So, but maybe the AI chatbot is the most, or therapy bot is the most vulnerable.
Yeah, maybe you should just do it in person and not have it recorded. How about that? If you were really concerned about privacy, how about we just go to total analog? Yeah, okay. So that's like a new development. And we'll see where it goes. I wanted to ask you then, I guess, about your most recent piece, which is about loneliness. And loneliness has been declared kind of a public health problem. There's a way in which the public health apparatus, one cynical take on this is that the public health apparatus is just sort of expanding to fill available space. And now that there's no pandemic, it has to come up with new epidemics to address. Another take on this is that loneliness is actually genuinely a problem, and the public health authorities are just acknowledging it and deciding to treat it as such. But you wrote this piece
It can be
called,
both.
well, yeah, it could also be both, right?
Yeah.
So you wrote this piece called "Loneliness Isn't a Public Health Problem," and so I wanted to just, I guess we can wrap up with this and go into a little bit of like your thinking on this, because I have a question in the back of my mind about kind of the conclusion that you drew, but I wanted you to sort of just kind of lay out the general argument, and then we can go into some of the details.
Sure. So my argument here is that when I title it "Loneliness Isn't a Public Health Problem," what I sort of mean is like that's not the best way to categorize it or characterize it like truly. And it's sort of weird that we're doing it like that. But nevertheless, it might actually be better to treat it as a public health problem, because that seems to be the main way that we actually deal with social problems now. So the argument briefly goes like this. So loneliness is a big problem in America and elsewhere. You can see that sort of trends around loneliness. So like people saying they feel lonely, people spending less time with friends and family, more time alone, people not feeling like they belong to a social group. These have been increasing very slowly for a long time, like, since the mid 70s, basically. And the internet has made them worse. COVID has made them worse, but these are sort of long-standing social trends. And I think COVID was when people sort of really realized, okay, this is really, really terrible. And now the public health authorities, especially the Surgeon General, want to do something about it. And the main way they're trying to frame the whole issue is not that loneliness is like bad because it sucks to be lonely, but that loneliness is bad because it'll kill you. So they give all these sort of correlations and associations that show that like people who are really, really lonely or really socially disconnected are more likely to die early or to have a heart attack, or what was the other one? Maybe diabetes or cancer. I mean, on their website and in their strategy document, they have just tons and tons of these studies. So I don't deny that those associations exist. However, to me, it seems like strange that we have to talk. The only reason we're really doing something about this and the way we're framing it is in this public health way. because there are all kinds of social problems that correlate with bad health outcomes. So like the examples I give are divorce, sexlessness, being incarcerated, like all of those correlate strongly with dying early and having heart attacks and things like that. But it would just seem wrong to sort of say we're going through an epidemic of incarceration or divorces or something like that. Because those are social psychological problems that have social psychological causes. But nevertheless, I finished by arguing, even though I don't really think we should be thinking about loneliness in this way, it may be that because our society is so medicalized, because people care so much about their health, and because with the COVID pandemic, individuals, companies, governments have been shown that they will mobilize to protect vulnerable people's health, it may be better still to frame loneliness as a health problem, because if we do, people might actually do something about it.
Okay, so one of the cuts on this is that they are, there is this real social problem, and the only way you can get people motivated enough to address it is by calling it a public health problem and saying that it's going to be bad for you for all these reasons. Another cut on this is that sort of the problem that they've identified to call it a public health problem is maybe too indirect, because you're essentially saying that there's no causal relationship, or at least there doesn't appear to be, or maybe it's too hard to pin down with all these associations and correlations. And one of the objections that I had when I was reading this, and like, I think your point is well taken. Like, it's very fuzzy, the extent to which something like loneliness or lack of personal interaction or meaningful relationships with others or whatever is bad for you, right? In a, I don't know, biological sense. But one, I'm not sure how clear of a separation there is between your like subjective well-being and your overall well-being. So if like the purpose of health, of public health, is to increase the public's general well-being physically and mentally, then I think it's hard to know where you delineate someone's subjective well-being from their actual well-being. So that would be like the first thing I would say. And then the second thing is, I'm aware, and I didn't have time to look into this research before we spoke today, but I am aware of a body of research that indicates, for example, that due to modularity in the brain, a lot of negative emotions are physiologically experienced in the same way as dealing with like physical pain or some kind of physical illness. So, for example, the stuff that I read usually has to do with like depression. And what's weird about depression is that it's not just, oh, I'm feeling down, I'm feeling, dour, I can't find any joy in my daily experiences. There's actually a whole bunch of physical correlates that come along with a depressed person, right? Some people say that it looks like inflammation in the body. And so those would be sort of the two things that I would say point to me that I don't think it's necessarily inaccurate to try to deal with a, let's just say, general lack of subjective well-being as a health issue, because of the fact that it's very hard to draw the line between how someone feels internally and their general like health, mental health, whatever it may be. And B, it is just true that like lonelier people are more stressed out. Lonelier people experience, higher degrees of negative emotions, and these negative emotions do have an effect inside the body. So what do you think of that?
So the first one was that subjective and sort of objective discomfort or dishealth or disease, right? Disease are related. And then the second one was that, well, it's sort of a similar point, right? That you can have real physical, pain caused by an emotional problem.
Right. So the second one is
And
like more of a particularity on the more general point, which is the first one.
yeah. So I think that's all true. And one thing that I originally had in that paper that I took out was just to keep it short, was a bit of explainer on sort of the relationship between those things. So, the more I learn about mental health and sort of mental discomfort and all kinds of things, the more it seems to me that sort of everything is correlated, right? So you have something like a P factor, which is, all kinds of psychological problems are all correlated with each other, and then you sort of have clusters within them. But then we also have now, someone recently released a thing called the D factor, which is disease factor, which is sort of taking a similar idea to all of health. So they started noticing, okay, well, this P factor correlates with all these other health problems. And so maybe there's actually this sort of overall D factor, which is just how prone to disease is a person, right? And that's going to have a substantial genetic component, but it's also probably going to have a substantial environmental component in interactions, because one could imagine how sort of, if you become really lonely or really anxious or something like that, you're going to see people less and take care of your health less and things like that. So there is a more holistic way of looking at all this that I do agree with you is factually true. So I suppose my objection to that is, to me, it seems like we're, as a society, moving more in that direction, but that is actually taking away from looking closely at what the problem that we actually care about is. And so I see this a lot with all kinds of things, whether it's mental health or physical health, but we start talking about problems as if the thing that's bad about the problem is it has these side effects, these like health effects, right? So for getting broken up with is bad because like it's bad for your mental health.
Right.
Or going through a
There's an epidemic of people getting dumped.
Yeah, I'm sure somebody could frame it all kinds of social issues in that way. And the truth is that if we like something that bugs me about kind of public health people and amateur sociologists is they sort of do this thing where they're like, well, everything's connected, right? And so if you're born poor, you're more likely to be unhealthy.
It's sort of a banal point, right? Like
it's a banal point. But I think coming in on the other side of that, I'm starting to see, okay, like everything is connected, but it might be connected because there's some people who are just sort of born to be healthy and do well and feel good, and some people who are born to feel really miserably and, as not necessarily as a result, but maybe just a correlate, have worse lives. And I mean, that's a terrible truth, but I think increasingly we're realizing that. But like my point with this piece more is like, what is the way we want to look at all of this? Is the best lens to view social problems through a medical lens, where everything becomes about this leading to people to be more stressed or more anxious, or I mean, a long time ago it was low self-esteem, right? Which has sort of gone away a bit. But like, is the problem with all the bad things that they're bad intrinsically, and so we should get rid of them, or that they lead to these sort of bad medical things we can check? And I think as we move towards a more health-focused, public health-dominated society, everything is being more and more like a checklist, where all the bad things are sort of these secondary things.
It reminds me of that. I don't know if you listen to Radiohead at all. There's
yes, a lot.
Yeah, Filter Happier, I think, is the song. Where
Fitter Happier, right?
Fitter Happier, yeah, that's it. So where he's just going through like the list of it's sort of like some sort of like a robotic health person listing off all the things that he's done to like improve his life recently. It's like eating regularly, like getting enough sleep, like whatever, right? And that's sort of the I guess nightmare scenario I'm imagining when you're describing this sort of like public healthization of everything.
It's and maybe it's a medicalization of everything or something. But I mean, this is a totally unrelated example, but a friend of mine recently went to do one of those cold plunges, where you like go in and you're just freezing or whatever. And I was like, how was it? And he was like, oh, like it was a huge dopamine hit. And I was like, do you mean
Right.
like it felt good? He was like, no, it was like a dopamine hit. I'm like, okay, like everything is becoming, and perhaps it's just new language. I'm not sure, but to me, it seems like we're moving away from talking about things in and of themselves and more towards just the side effects of those things or the neurochemical, uh, reaction we have to those things. And I think that's like that's if we're talking purely truthfully, I think that's not the best way to look at why problems are bad, and to address them.
Hmm. So yeah, so I guess what you're kind of saying is that like there's one thing that's going on, which is like the labels that we're applying to problems are kind of like too broad, right? And that you want more like specificity, or you want like better descriptions of what it is that we're actually trying to address, right? So saying something like there's an epidemic of loneliness, while it may be true that like loneliness is going up and there are a lot of like sociological reasons why, and it's something that we want to address, you're sort of saying that like dealing with that as a description of the problem is kind of too low resolution. And um it like, would that be fair to say?
It would be fair to say, and as I say later, it might be it might be a better way to actually fix it. But in terms of how we're all thinking about these things, too low, yeah, too low resolution is bang on.
Hmm. And um and then I guess the other possible, or like another way of like objecting to this, is that like maybe we just shouldn't make everything a public health problem, right? Like maybe if people are more lonely, there needs to be, I don't know, some sort of more like bottom up set of solutions, right? Like maybe we need to reinvigorate community organizations, or get people to, be members of church. Or I think in the article you talk about, previously religious institutions would have like served would have played a role in like alleviating some of these problems. And so I guess another angle on this is just that public health is kind of like the wrong vehicle for thinking about how to address some of these problems.
Well, I mean, you know, it's like again, I go back to the example of if we're talking about an epidemic of divorces or an epidemic of incarceration, like I think that would just sound silly to people, right? Because
Mm,
they would say, um, they would even though those are all social things, right? As is loneliness, but people would say like, no, this is not a health problem. This doesn't require doctors to be talking about this. Like when you go to your doctor, should your doctor tell you, hey, like you should really not get divorced? Like, is that, because if you do, then you're gonna have a heart attack or you're more likely to have a heart attack. Like that would strike people as
yes.
odd, right? Um,
No, I
but
mean,
what
why not? It's worth considering, right? Like, hey, your life is going to be worse if you do this.
Well, I was actually thinking maybe I should write like a companion piece to this and pitch it to like some conservative magazine and be like, like this the social conservative case for turning all social issues into public health issues, and just be like, oh well, if you get divorced, actually you're gonna die more, and like every doctor should be telling everybody that, and there's sort of a way you could frame it that way too, but my point is it's absurd. Is it's making that category of public health problems way too broad.
Right, right. Okay, so I mean, I think we've done like a good overview of kind of the people get a taste for what your project's about and really what you're doing. I would just say as like a final compliment to you that I really actually kind of like the format of your writing. Like it's you put together these pieces that are like not too long but detailed enough to get the point across and provide substantive evidence. And the way that you sort of frame each topic so far, it's like the only word I can think of, it's like very consumable. So I think it's an interesting project what you're doing, and I'm excited to see like more stuff that you're going to be working on in the future. um anything you want to say before we head out?
Well, first of all, thank you for the compliment. And yeah, I guess I would just say that, mental health right now is in a sort of interesting period where there's a lot of stuff happening in the startup world. A lot of new kind of technologies are being used to sort of push older products or services or ideas and things like that. So I think it's a really cool time to be creative in the mental health world and to be paying attention. But I also think it's a time when a lot of the same sort of replication crisis slop and poorly designed study methodology and all the stuff is going to come back, but this time it's going to have a lot of money behind it. So just be careful with the stuff you're potentially investing in or doing, but at the same time, don't let data get in the way of having fun and exploring, your new chatbot girlfriend, therapist, or
Oh
whatever.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Right, right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Jonah. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Everyone, you can find Jonah at his Substack at mentaldisorder.substack.com, on Twitter at Jonah Davids1. And this has been another episode of the Hacking State podcast.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex.